episode of the Tennis IQ podcast. I'm Brian Lomax.
And I'm Josh Berger, and in today's episode, we're going to be talking about everybody's favorite concept, losing, and different approaches and mindsets that you can apply to losing, because as we know, as tennis players and as athletes, losing is inevitable, both at the micro level in terms of losing points during a tennis match. We've talked about sort of this devilish scoring system, how after every single point, there is that instant feedback that you receive as a tennis player. You either lost or you won. And how you view that result, whether you lost or won that previous point, can have a big impact on both the results of the remainder of the match and ultimately your success as a tennis player. So both at the micro level and then at the more macro level in terms of losing matches, how you might respond to losing certain types of matches. We might talk about certain situations that may be more challenging, whether it's losing to certain types of players or losing at certain moments during a match or losing perhaps for certain reasons. So number one, thinking about some approaches after you have lost, and then also sort of your general philosophy and approach to competition and how losing fits into that broader approach. Um, so Brian, I guess as you start to think about this topic, what do you usually talk with athletes about? I guess as you start to break down competition and this inevitability of losing.
Yeah, I think you hit it on the head there, Josh, when you said the philosophical understanding of what competition is about. Um, because there are levels to that too, right? There's competition of this match I'm playing today, but then there's also competition in the sense of over the course of my career and understanding, the role of competition in terms of helping me to become the best player I can become. If competition is all about winning, and this is actually part of the one of the more famous books in positive psychology or humanistic psychology, Flow by Mihai Csikszentmihalyi. He talks about the optimal benefit of competition is helping you to perfect and improve your skills. And he notes that when it becomes all about winning, at some point the enjoyment of the activity will be lost. And I think that's a key concept, because lots of players will tell you it's all about winning. That's the point of it, and I think that is perhaps a point of it, but probably not the primary point. And really, we should always be playing to win when we're competing. I think that's really important. But the winning in itself is difficult to control. And so, if we could be more focused, sort of in the long term, becoming the best player we can become, um, and letting competition inform us as to where we are in that journey. So each match that you have, it's a good way to measure where your skills are today. Jorge Capistani talked about this with us in our interview with him some time ago about how he views competition as like a test or a quiz. And it's just really letting you know where you are today and which skills need to be sharpened and which skills are working, and then we can keep going with that. So I think understanding that, and then as you said, losses are part of it. Um, and it's not that when we talk about losing, it's not like we're accepting it as like we're okay with it. I think people, when you lose a match, I think there should be some level of disappointment. But that's probably on a continuum, right? We don't want it to be a level of disappointment where you can't function for a week because you're still thinking about this particular match that you played. But there should be some disappointment because hey, we are playing to win, and I think that a healthy level of disappointment can then create a motivation. If we're looking at competition in the long term, to okay, let me now objectively see what I could do better, right? Maybe disappointed for an hour or so, but at a certain point, you got to cut it off and then be able to look at that match. And I think that can be a trap for some. Uh, I honestly have felt that at times in my life where there have been some matches where I've lost 7-6 in the third, and I really had a hard time getting it out of my head. Um, but eventually you can move on. So I think, yeah, starting with that philosophical piece, Josh, I think is important. Understanding what the role of competition is in our lives. We're not playing the Olympics every single time we step out there. But again, we're always playing to win. So what are your thoughts on that in terms of the point and the benefit of competition?
Yeah, yeah. To me, I think you touched on a lot of good things. I mean, competition is certainly a test. Um, it's certainly a look at where you're at right now, in relation to where you've been, and then also in relation to your peers. But it's also a way to help you improve as a tennis player, where if you're constantly training and not competing, and this is something that I see, with some players that I coach, where maybe whether adults or kids, where maybe they compete occasionally, but most of the time they're practicing or they're training. Um, it's tough to really continue to push, to push your own limits and to really see where you're at. As we know, competition, there's a higher level of pressure, compared to, when there's no stakes and you're just hitting, or you're just maybe playing against a friend, on the practice court. So when you're playing with more pressure and there's more at stake and it feels more important, it's going to be more challenging, and it's really a better way to really gauge your current level, and to continue to improve as a tennis player. So that would be my first point. And then also just understanding as a tennis player that you're gonna, every step of the way, there will be losses, there will be setbacks. And I mean, you look at the US Open, or any tournament for that matter, and the main draw, 128 players enter. 127 of those players are gonna go home, having lost their most recent match. So it just shows how critical that skill of coming back from a loss is. Where if you lose that match, whether it's the first round or it's in the final, and as you said, Brian, if you have a can't function for that next week after that match, regardless of the score, it's going to be much tougher to bounce back from that, for that next tournament or for that next event or for continuing to train um, after the tournament, leading up to whatever comes next. So, to me, it's, yes, we want to be competitive. Yes, we want to, um, be great competitors and do everything in the moment and leading up to it, of course, to give ourselves the best chance to win. But also understanding this, that it is inevitable that at times we will lose. And okay, when that does happen, are we able to view it in the right way, that hey, this is a part of competition. This is something that will happen. This is also, hopefully there's some lessons here to be learned from this experience today, that you went through. And okay, what comes next, thinking, I think, Brian, we were talking off air a little bit, how we want to get in that mindset of being more solution focused and thinking more about, the solution and what can we improve on, rather than being stuck on that problem, or in my view, being stuck on that match. And I can't believe that just happened. I can't believe that third set tiebreaker went down like that, or I can't believe that I got nervous in that moment, or, lost my focus, or whatever it may be. So no, I think, broadly, understanding the role of losing in competition, that it is a common experience that the tennis players will have, and that the bouncing back aspect of it is a critical piece. And then also, trying to get in that mindset, sooner rather than later, of okay, you know, what now? What comes next? Even we referenced, Jorge Capistani, going back actually to that WIN acronym of okay, what's important now? Okay, it's a few hours after the match. You've regrouped. You've thought about that match. You've maybe thought about what went well, what were some teachable moments, things you learned, and then okay, now what's important now, and how can we move on to whatever comes next. To me, also, sometimes that involves looking back at that development plan, and we've talked about that. I think it was the episode where we talked about preparing for 2021, sort of preparing for the new year, and talking about some broader development plans that tennis players might be using, like a 3-month plan, for instance. And maybe sometimes after a loss, it can be helpful to look back at that development plan and think, okay, are there any adjustments that we want to make here? Or maybe there aren't. Maybe it's just a situation that happened, and again, it's going to happen sometimes, and we just want to move on rather than making any changes. But that can be a time where thinking about adjustments that could be made, and then just getting back on that horse, so to speak, and continuing the training process and continuing working on whatever aspects of your game, mentally, physically, tactically, that you're working on.
I think one thing you kind of alluded to at the beginning of what you were saying there was around how we may handle individual losses, right? One of the reasons we're talking about this more philosophical perspective is that when sometimes when players lose, they identify with the loss a little too much. They let it affect their own self confidence or belief, maybe their identity as a player is somehow harmed in some way. Maybe I'm not as good as I thought I was, or those types of things. I think a helpful way to look at tennis for everybody is to consider it like a life project. This is something that you're doing. It's just like a project in your life. It's not who you are necessarily. Like we don't want to over-identify with our tennis. That like if I lose a tennis match, that it says something about me. It's simply a performance. It's simply the experience maybe of loss, the experience of failure. It doesn't mean you are a failure or you are a loser. And I think that's an important distinction. And so if we can depersonalize it a little bit and look at your tennis game as a life project or a project, then can perhaps you can take a more objective viewpoint of it, like you said with the development plan. All right, this is like my project plan. This is what we're working on in these moments in time, right? So for those of us who have held like corporate jobs like I have, you get Microsoft Project or some other thing with Gantt charts and whatever. I mean, you could take it to that level, but that's what you want to do when you're working on certain aspects of your game. But when you go out and you compete, it's like taking your project and you're putting it out in the wild and it's getting tested. And then at the end of it, you look at the results. And the more objective you can be with how your strategies worked, how your strokes held up, how your mental game held up, really provides a lot more information so that the next time you go out there, all right, I have some things to work on, I have some things to improve. And I think that's the one of the bigger challenges is can you depersonalize the experience? So the idea of it is an experience, it is not necessarily you, right? You're simply experiencing loss and failure. You are not a loser, you are not a failure. And so that I think takes some perspective shifting as well. So when we are able to do that more, I think it's as you said, Josh, it's easier to go on and figure out what's next. Now this can also happen, I think, within a match. When we start to lose points and whatever, we get very judgmental, or it can happen. Players will start to believe in themselves less. They'll doubt themselves, and I think that's another trap. Is again we're personalizing the experience. We don't want to lose points. We don't want to like normalize it to that point, but it's very normal that that happens. And as we've talked about here, the most important point in a match always the next one. So we have to be able to quickly get through that. Maybe there are lessons to learn from that last point. There may not be. Sometimes it's just lucky shots or whatever. You just kind of get back to what your game plan is. Um, but when we start to personalize losing of points or mistakes, In a tennis match, you begin to harm, I think, some of the critical skills toward mental toughness that are necessary in order to navigate the difficulty of a match, right? We have to win 2 sets. You have to get from 0 to 6 in 1 set, then you have to do it again in 2 sets. Um, that's a long process. And if you're constantly judging and feeling bad along the way, you're going to harm your confidence, you're going to harm your belief. And so I feel like there's a certain number of, I don't call them like mental toughness processes that need to be at a high level throughout a match. Optimism, always believing that you can play better, that your best tennis is still in front of you. I think self belief, or we could even call it self efficacy, the belief that I can win, no matter what the score is, the belief I can win. I think that's huge because if you don't have that belief, you most assuredly will lose based on a bit, right? I think the ability to do many of these things, regardless of the score, is really, really important. So I think those are two big ones there, and I think they're related. Optimism and self belief are related. I think your effort level can't be affected by the score, and that happens a lot. Your focus can't be affected, right? You need to have that full focus. We often talk about the idea of playing 1 point at a time, and that's why we have a routine. But I think in order to really do well with the routine, you got to know the why. Why is it important to be present focused? If you don't understand that the next point is the most important point in the match, you're not going to be able to effectively use your routine because you don't have that philosophical perspective or background to understand, hey, that's why this is so important, instead of just going through the motions of the routine and not really ending up where you need to be. So I think it's important for all of us to examine that our fighting spirit, our effort, our optimism, our self-belief, that those things do not, that we're performing those at a high level regardless of the score, and that we're simply um, pushing on throughout the match because it's a long process. Like we said, there's going to be lost points. There's probably going to be streaks of, who knows, 4, 5, 6 points in a row you may lose, and but that doesn't mean you'll lose the match, right? So, like you said earlier, Josh, there's a lot of losing that goes on in points, and it's how we withstand that within a match, and then it's how we uh, react to or respond to it or regroup when it's after a match.
Yeah, what you're talking about, how there's, number one, it's inevitable to lose matches. It is, as we've talked about in the past, it's inevitable to lose points during a match, and sometimes those are consecutive, like you're saying. I look at somebody like Novak Djokovic, and I'm sure we'll talk about him more when we talk more about the U.S. Open, and recap it, but. Um, just seeing how he has this ability to put things behind him. He'll lose the first set, and you see him during that set break between sets 1 and 2 or whatever it may be, and he's has his eyes closed, or he's calming his breath down, and he talks about this as well. And whatever just happened, he's able to put that behind him. He's able to put that lost set behind him and move on quickly, rather quickly. And it actually reminds me of this concept of losing points. Reminds me of a presentation that I think I've referenced here by Craig O'Shaughnessy, um, you know, who has worked with Djokovic as well as other ATP, WTA players, writes for ATP, Brain Game Tennis, and really broke down the statistics and showed that even the best players in the world, the Novak Djokovic, the Ash Barty, the top number one players on the men's and women's side over the most recent years, they're not winning 70-80% of points. They're winning closer to 55% of the points. And what does that mean? That even the best in the world are losing right around half of their points over the course of a season. So if we lose a point, and that immediately, we immediately have an emotional response, and that immediately impacts our self-identity and who we are. And, oh, I suck. I can't do this. My backhand is horrible. I can never beat this person. If that's our initial response after losing a point, then we're gonna have a long day. It's gonna be really tough out there, considering that even the best in the world are losing, right around 45% of their points. So it highlights how important that is to be able to view things in the right way, and to be able to move on time and time again after a lost point or after a lost match as well. Um, another concept I would add in is being able to view things non-judgmentally. You mentioned that in a tennis match, I just need to get up to 6 games in one set before my opponent, and then I need to get up to 6 games in the next set before my opponent. And I think it's also a good way to view losses as well. That, hey, I lost today because my opponent was a bit better than me. My opponent won a few more of those big points over the course of the match that we know, oftentimes these matches do just come down to a few points here and there. Um, and my opponent, they won a few more of those big points today. They got to 6, faster. Maybe we're playing no ad and they won a few more of those deuce points. And I think if you can view it, you know, if you can detach from the emotion, that it's so common to place on these things, and that attachment that people have to their results and to their performance, and view it a little bit more non-judgmentally and just objectively as, hey, this is what happened today. um, then if you can view it in that way, it's easier to put it behind you. It's easier to make whatever adjustments need to be made, um, in terms of making adjustments to give yourself a better chance to so that it doesn't happen again, so that you can improve upon that performance going forward. So that's another point that I think is pivotal. I mean, whether it's during a match in terms of keeping your perspective and maintaining your composure, but also after a match, in terms of moving on to the next one and not um, losing any steam, or not letting that one match totally derail you from your progress.
Yeah, yeah. I think it's important also to understand how we explain losses to ourselves. So this is there's a theory called attribution theory. It's, how we attribute losses, and an exercise I'll often do with players is some I call the not a, that's something I got from Martin Seligman, one of the founders of positive psychology, and it's called a narrative style exercise. And there are different types of narrative styles. There's someone who may describe something that happened to them in an optimistic way, and then there's a pessimistic style of looking at it. And there are different characteristics of those styles that I think listeners may find interesting. So typically, when let's say you won your match, you may describe this, the success part as feeling like, yes, that's who I am. That's a kind of a permanent thing. That's what I do. Um, and yeah, that's just me. I'm a winner in that regard, and yeah, that's my game. And then you may describe losses as being more temporary type of thing. So that was just that was just a bad day. That was you, and then maybe bring it to something that you didn't do well, right? I just didn't prepare the way I needed to for that tournament. I know I can do better in this, right? So this idea of we want to lock in success as being part of who we are, and we want to look at losses as being more sort of temporary or transient things. And that way, we're not, again, doing what I said earlier, we're not over identifying with the loss, right? So someone who is a little bit more pessimistic in their style may feel like, oh, yeah, this is always happens to me. I always play bad, in these kinds of tournaments. I'm just a loser, everything that I do, that type of thing, right? So we don't want it to feel like it's permanent and pervasive in everything that we do from a negative perspective. So I think it's important, like when we talk to people, and even if you're a coach, listen for the language that your player may be using. Are they saying things like when they lose that like this is something that always happens? This is, I'm just not a good player. Those types of things. Um, we want to again decouple that, but we also want to help them transition to, hey, they are a good player, and some of these things you're experiencing, these are just transient things that are happening on your journey going forward. And then I think the last piece of this is when we're analyzing a match, and you can get somebody to the right narrative style there, help them take a what I would call an extreme ownership perspective. Even in a win, I think you can do this. Is what are just a few things you could have done better? Like own it. There's no excuses, no blame game here. What could you have done better? And don't accept I don't know as an answer. Again, you mentioned earlier, Josh, the solution focused, right? Want to help players, whether this is for yourself or you're working with some players, you want to help them be solution focused. So when you're asking them to take extreme ownership on what just happened out there, right? Take responsibility for what just happened out there. And you're asking them how they could,
Hmm.
what are some ideas that they have on improving, whether that's preparation, practice, mental prep, um, ground strokes, serves, whatever. Um, have them take some ownership on, what are some little things that could be better, and then don't accept I don't know as an answer. And you could give them some time, but that's going to train them to be more solution focused because if you're always giving the solutions, then how will this player be able to handle the heat of the battle when he or she is out there on her own in a match? Because they're going to be able to need to think about solutions there. So I think how we explain these things to ourselves or how we explain losses to other people is an important indicator of how we're thinking and how we can shift to something that's we're not making losses feel like a permanent thing and that it's pervasive in our lives.
Yeah, no, I really like that. I think what you're saying, it reminds me a lot of, or I think it connects to how we view, sport as a whole, how, making sure that we're not identifying too much with that sport or with our results in that sport.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Brings me back to the episode that we did on injuries and coming back from injuries, but also understanding that, there may be a period of time where you're away from the sport for a while. There also may be a time where based on your choice or based on an injury or something out of your control that you have to retire from your sport, that you won't be able to play it anymore. um, Tennis, as we know, is more of a lifetime sport where, I see people at the club that are in their 70s, 80s. There's, people I hit with in their 80s on a regular basis. Or beyond as well. But they're also, for some people, there comes a time where they can't play anymore, and or maybe that's, a shorter period of time, like a short injury, or a longer period of time, a couple of years, or many months, or whatever it may be, or a period of time where they can't play. And if you have your self image and your self concept based and wrapped up at, I am a tennis player, this is who I am, this is what defines me, rather than, as you said, Brian, this is a project that I'm doing. I'm trying to be as good as I can be, but this is not who I am. If you get to that point, whether it's an injury or retirement, it becomes a lot tougher to process that if you don't have other aspects of your identity to fall back on or to rely on during that moment. So um, I think it's important, when working with a player to understand them, them as a person, and understand, everything other than just the tennis side, other than just what they do on the court. What else is important to them? What else do they value? What else do they enjoy? So that if that were to happen in terms of an injury or retirement, they it's not it's not everything that's ending. It's just one piece um, of their life. It's just one piece of what they have going on, and it's it's a loss like what we're talking about. It's, at the most macro level, but it's not losing everything because you have other pieces of your identity that are established and that you can, still go get back to and still, um, it's easier to put things into perspective if tennis is one of the things that you do and your entire identity is not fully based on that.
Yeah, not fully wrapped up in being a player, because even if you say are unable to play, that doesn't mean you couldn't do some other things around the sport of tennis,
Yep.
whether that's volunteering or getting on a board, or getting into the business of tennis. There's so many things that can be done in the sport that people can continue with. Yeah, so yeah, it's sort of the transition to retirement, whether that's a pro player who can no longer compete at a high level, or someone, as you said, maybe physically they're just not able to do it anymore.
Or
But
after high school and college as well. A lot
yeah,
of people, even if they continue maybe to play at a more recreational level, or they continue maybe to compete in, leagues, that, after high school or college, maybe that's the most consistent competition that they have, or the most intense competition that they go through. So, after that experience, there could also be some sort of a loss or some sort of, feeling that something has been taken away from them. I mean, I think back to that, the last year with COVID and everything, how the season ended so abruptly, for college students, high school students, athletes everywhere, really, in, some shape or form. Maybe it was their high school or college season that was taken away. Maybe it was a major tournament for some players that was, or tournaments over, months that were taken away and they weren't able to play in. And that's a loss right there that has to be handled and has to be viewed in the right way as, part of that process, something inevitable, but also, um, you know, a teachable moment and a, learning opportunity, trying to view it as an opportunity to improve in some way, to grow in some way, rather than, that threat of, something's being taken away from me, this is so unfair. But trying to, I think it's helpful to acknowledge those feelings of, maybe this doesn't seem fair, or this, um, this, I can't believe this happened, that disappointment or that frustration, but being able to move on and being able to get into that solution focused mindset where you're focused on, okay, what now? What can we do at this point? Is there an opportunity here? Okay, maybe you have some more time at home. Okay, what can we do with that time rather than, oh, I hate being at home. I wish I was on the court. I wish I was playing in the conference finals right now, or in the conference tournament, or in this other tournament going on. But trying to shift into that solution based mindset.
yeah, yeah, and I think one of there's different models for stages that athletes go through, like when they're injured. But one of the ones I like is called like the effective stages of injury. But in this, what you're describing, even with COVID, the last stage is like the important part, I think, and it's like this stage called determined coping, right? Determined to deal with what is in front of you at that moment. And I think it fits in well with what we're talking about with respect to being solution oriented, um, being able to take the perspective of tennis is simply a life project that I'm dedicating myself to, that I'm trying to get the best that I can at. Um, yeah, I think when we are able to adopt these better perspectives, have a better philosophical basis for how we look at our tennis, it can make handling all these different little adversities or even big adversities much easier. I think a lot of us, whether it's as athletes or as students or business people, we all had to make adjustments during that time. And if we were simply looking at it from a almost like a deficit piece where this is what I've lost, you get stuck there. But if you can look at it, it is what it is. What do I need to do now in order to continue to move on, whatever life project you're working on? I know for like us, I think we've talked about this. this podcast wouldn't probably exist if it weren't for COVID. You know, you and I probably would not know each other if not for COVID, right? So that was, I think, on our part, some good adjusting and working on our businesses and our, uh, careers as sports psych professionals in a very sort of life project way. That hey, these are some things we think would be interesting. Let's collaborate. Let's do this. I think in doing this kind of thing, I think what's nice about you, Josh, is and I think we've both done this. We've put our egos aside and we've collaborated on this. Some people could say, I don't want to work with that guy. He's same sport as me, same business. He's my competitor. Not at all. I mean, I want you to be as successful as possible. I mean, that just helps the profession if we have more great practitioners out there. And so I think the more that people can take those types of perspectives, um, helping each other, looking at these things as projects, and not being so ego oriented about this, and certainly not looking at things as, again, permanent, and more, focusing on what's going wrong in the past or what has gone wrong. Like, what can we do now? And I think that's true with just even tennis matches like we've been talking about. Because let's face it, certain losses probably are harder to deal with than others. We were talking earlier, those third set, maybe 7-6, 7-5, 6-4 losses can be really hard. A loss where maybe you're playing great and now your conditioning has perhaps betrayed you a little bit. We were talking about a match earlier we were watching last night there that happened. That happened to me recently. Um, those are harder to live with, and you've got to take an extreme ownership piece to that, or you could just like be kind of woe is me and not do anything about it and just go out there and repeat, keep doing what you're doing. And as the quote says, that's a bit of insanity to keep doing the same things and expect different results. And so the more that we can be learning from these things, even the hard losses, I think you were mentioning, Josh, even, what's another tough loss that people have is like when we lose perhaps to someone we think we should beat, or maybe we definitely should beat. And those are tough because those can be hits to your identity. Like if you see yourself as a good player, yet now you've lost a match to somebody who's allegedly not as good, that can definitely hurt you. Or maybe in that performance you just really not only lost, but you underperformed. Maybe you were passive in that type of thing. And those are sometimes the losses where people will shy away from looking at. But in reality, it's probably a gold mine because what that match taught you was a whole bunch of things you should never, ever do again.
That's
And that's why sometimes these horrible losses are the losses you should be grateful for, because there's a potential for so much benefit coming out of that. There's so much silver lining that could come out of that if you choose to look at it from the perspective, okay, here are the things I will never do again, and really commit to that. I've had a match like that, and it changed my. I played great for the next 2 years because of that. So I would say recommend to people like even in those matches where they played terribly, where they lost to someone they feel like they shouldn't have lost to, like just a bad loss. Look at it, treat it as something. All right, I vow never to do this or that ever again in a match because I know it doesn't work. This loss really demonstrated that it doesn't work. And sometimes without those bad losses, Josh, you don't have the wake up call that you need. And I like to think sometimes those bad losses are wake up calls.
no, absolutely, absolutely. I mean, I think we've all been there. I think any tennis player that's played enough matches has had those bad losses, whether it's a player that, you feel like you are much stronger than as a player. Um, and it can be a huge hit to the ego. But as you said, those are often the best opportunities to really learn from those experiences, to learn, those are the best teachable moments. Maybe you lost because you didn't, maybe somebody lost because they didn't take their opponent as seriously. They overlooked their opponent and they let their own level drop. Maybe they lost because, as you said, it was, some sort of fitness issue. Maybe they lost because something to do with the mental game. You lost focus, and you let a few games slip away that were pivotal, or you didn't handle the pressure in the way that you wanted to, or you got frustrated and you let your frustrations out, and either your level dropped or you were penalized in some way. But in any of these situations, there's a lot to be learned. There's a lot of adjustments that you can make and things that you can change. So as you said, that this never happens again. Um, I think another piece to losing is going through a slump and or maybe consecutive losses. We talked about these consecutive points and how that they can happen in a match, but also consecutive losses. Maybe you're playing tournaments and you've lost in the first round a few times in a row, or maybe it's in a team format and you or your team has lost multiple times in a row, and it's okay. To me, it's that same process. It's okay not identifying too much with the performance, but really being able to objectively look at it and think, okay, what do I need to do so that this doesn't continue happening over and over again? Are there things to do with my fitness? Are there things, are there adjustments I need to make with my mental game? Maybe I'm not handling the pressure well because I don't have a plan for what I'm going to do in these higher pressure situations, right? Maybe I lose my focus because that's never something I've really trained or paid any much attention to. So I think if you can view these things objectively, it's a lot easier to actually identify what needs your focus, what you need to put your attention towards, and then that adjustment can be made. But until then, and I mean, one of my pet peeves, I think I've mentioned this, coaching players at different levels, is when they get off the court and maybe this is sort of an immediate response is just, hey, I don't want to talk about it right now. But what happened out there, or not even what happened out there, but how was the match? It's like, oh, I lost. And it's like, okay, you lost, but how was the match? And trying to dig deeper past that. And I mean, if you aren't able to look at it and you just want to push it aside, then nothing will ever change. And as you said, it's the definition of insanity, right? You don't change anything and you expect different results. Um, in order to make changes, in order so that never happens again, you need to sometimes take that hard look in the mirror and really understand, okay, I lost to this player whose UTR is significantly lower or is ranked a lot lower, or who I feel like is, not of the same caliber for this main reason or for these few main reasons. And okay, I am going to, you know, plan to make those adjustments and plan to be accountable as well. I'm not just deciding to do that. I'm really going to take action here. I'm going to have that extreme ownership approach, as you've mentioned, Brian, over my tennis training, over my journey as a player, over this project. And I'm gonna, take ownership over those aspects of my game that caused that result today that I want to improve upon.
I think I want to go back to the slump piece, Josh. I think that's very interesting because they've done. There's been a lot of research in sports psychology about what they call the hot hand phenomenon, right? So typically, like in basketball, you'll see somebody who's made a lot of shots in a row, and you think he's hot or whatever. And a lot of that's been somewhat discounted in terms of whether that's really true or more of a perception. But there are some psychological factors that go with somebody who has a winning streak and someone who has a losing streak. And so when you go on a losing streak, that self belief and self efficacy, we have to make sure that that is not affected, right? That that doesn't drop. And I wanted to share a quote. and it's from a basketball player, and I think you can apply this to losses in tennis. But this is the kind of self belief one needs to have, the kind of optimism. So it's from Isaiah Thomas. He was a point guard for the Detroit Pistons in the 80s and the 90s. And he said, I've always believed no matter how many shots I miss, I'm going to make the next one. And that's elite level self belief, elite level confidence, this ability that I will make that shot. So even if you're on a losing streak, you've got to step onto the court believing you can win, believing you're going to win this match. If you go out there with anything less than that, the losing streak likely continues. And that's hard in tennis. I'm not saying that like that's easy, but it's the same thing like when you're in a match. No matter what the score is, you've got to believe you can win. If you don't, you won't. So that's the only thing I think I'd like to say about the slump piece, because that does happen. People will get into slumps, and then that can get in their heads, and they're walking out onto the court assuming they're going to play poorly, assuming they're going to lose, and then it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy.
Yeah, no, I think you bring up a great point that in order to win or in order to have a chance to win, you have to have that self belief that you can win. And I think there's a distinction here that doesn't mean that you're saying that you're going to win,
Right.
but you're saying that you're capable of
Correct.
winning.
Yeah.
I can win today. There's a great to me that reminds me a lot of some of my own personal experiences. Going into matches maybe against somebody who's ranked higher than me, and thinking, oh, this person's so good. There's no way I can beat that person, and I didn't. Was that the only reason? No, but that mindset certainly doesn't help. So, understanding that a lot can happen in a tennis match. Lower ranked players beat higher ranked players all the time. Um, and understanding also, I think Brad Gilbert in Winning Ugly, he summarized it in a great way, where he says, if there's two players of a somewhat similar caliber, I think I may mix up these numbers a little bit, but he says each player maybe 5% of the time, maybe it's 10%. Let's say 5% of the time, that player is going to be just unbeatable, right? Maybe they're just on fire, they're in the zone, they're in the flow, and maybe there's not too much that their opponent can do. So each player maybe is in that sort of zone maybe 5% of the time, and that leaves the remaining 90% of the time that something can happen, right? That an upset could happen. A close match could happen. There's also the element of luck that, as we know, can certainly play a part in some of these matches. Maybe it's a couple points here and there, or you hit the net cord or whatever it may be. But understanding that, regardless of who you're playing, even if this somebody is, you view them to be a stronger player, that you are capable of winning, right? On the right day, in the right conditions, you are capable of winning this match. And as we've talked about, we can't we can't actually control winning, but what we can do is we can give ourselves the best possible chance to be in a winning position. We can control the controllables and try to control everything within our influence to give us that best possible chance regardless of who we're playing, but also understanding that in order to win in the first place, we need to believe that it's possible. Because if not, it really can become that self-fulfilling prophecy that if you go into a match, for instance, against somebody who you view to be stronger than you, and you say, oh, well, I really hope I don't get crushed here, that would be really embarrassing. I really, hope it's a competitive match. I'd be, really happy if I win, 6 games over the match. And then all of a sudden you're at 4-all in the first set or 5-all in the first set. That can very quickly turn into a 6-4 or 7-5. And I've seen that countless times, where that player becomes almost satisfied with that sort of result because that's what they think they're capable of. So being able to change that self concept and that that opinion of yourself in terms of what you're capable of doing and achieving can really make a huge difference in your capability when you get into that moment where instead of it being 4-all and you're satisfied to even get to this point, you say, okay, great, I'm not getting crushed. You know, I'm saving myself from the embarrassment. Instead of that sort of a mindset, it's okay, it's 4-all. Like this is what I've been working towards. This is a great opportunity here. I'm supposed to be here. I'm not here by accident. And let's go.
Yeah, I mean, that last piece is playing to win,
Yep.
regardless, right? And before that, as you said, Josh, the satisfaction leads to a drop in your compete level, right? So I think of compete level as the maintaining a high level on all these controllable behaviors, your attitude, your effort, how you focus, your routines, breathing, your body language. Those things are what help keep you competitive in a match and keeping those at a high level. And if you begin to get satisfied, some of those the level drops in some of those areas. Especially probably the more mental ones, because now your objective is no longer to win. Your objective is to satisfy somebody's opinion, yours or maybe somebody else's, that this is a respectable score. So naturally, you're going to lose that 6-4 or 7-5, as you said. I think that is a something that every aspiring tennis player goes through. The the trick is learning from that that's the wrong approach, so that when they get in that situation, they believe they can win. As you mentioned, lower ranked players beat higher ranked players all the time, but not if they don't believe. If they don't believe they can win, they will not win. You see this in the NCAA basketball tournament when 15 seeds beat 2 seeds. The 15 seed didn't come in assuming they were going to lose. They came in with a game plan and focus, effort, attitude. And now that more of those upsets have happened, it only increases that for more 15. And I think even we've now had at least one 16 beat a 1 seed. So that's the key, is you got to believe and you got to always be playing to win. Don't play for respectability, play to win. You'll get more respect out of that than you will by kind of, you know, giving it away in the end.
Yeah, it's the right it's definitely the right mindset. I think it's almost a bit of a tightrope, or it's a bit of a it can be tough to manage that always playing to win, but also being able to detach from that result after the fact and not placing too much emphasis or not identifying too much with it, so that you can view it in the right way and um, continue forward after that result. But I think that's absolutely right, that's you don't want to be playing not to lose, or playing to avoid failure and having that sort of a mindset. You instead want to be making sure you're always playing to win. And we've talked about that as at the more micro level as well during a match, that if the match is on the line and you feel like you are sort of avoiding failure, playing not to lose, not trying to miss, waiting for the other person to go for it, and hopefully they'll miss. Then you're going to probably look back at that match with a lot more regret than, hey, then I went for it. I played to win. I went for my shots, whether or not it ended up working out in your favor. You
Right.
have less to regret. You have you're playing in the way that you want to, regardless of the outcome.
So really interesting topic today, Josh. I think you're discussing losing and losses, valuable, right? I think a lot of good perspectives came out of this conversation. So I thought that was a good topic for today. So thank you, Josh, and thank you, everyone, for listening. For more on today's episode, please check out the show notes. If you have any feedback or questions for me or Josh, please email us at tennisiqpodcast@gmail.com. You can also use the Twitter hashtag tennisiq. Additionally, please subscribe to the show on your podcast platform of choice, including YouTube, so you can be notified of new episodes. You can also check out our Instagram page. Thanks again, and we'll talk to you soon in our next episode.